Got a little worried that mic was going to roll away. Now, the next candidate to the stage is going to be Heather Mizeur. Mizeur was born in Illinois to a fifth-generation farming family and attended the University of Illinois. Delegate Mizeur went on to work more than a decade on Capitol Hill, capping her career there as Senator Kerry's Domestic Policy Director from 2003 to 2006. She also owns a 34-acre organic farm in Chestertown, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Delegate Mizeur to the stage. I see you brought your own water bottle. As you know, you've got 2 minutes to use the floor as you like, so if you're ready, it's all you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming and attending the forum today. Yes, I brought my own water bottle because I believe, as an environmentalist, I'm really big into recycling, and so do it the natural way. Deborah, thank you. My wife, Deborah, is here with me tonight, and so I thank her for joining us, and thank you for putting together tonight's conversation. Some people run for governor because they want the job. Others run because they want to do the job. And I have always been a doer. In the 8 years I've been in Annapolis, I have a history of bringing people together to get big things done. Like finding new and innovative ways to enroll more children in health insurance in our state. My Kids First plan found 50,000 more children to get health insurance in Maryland. I teamed up with a Tea Party caucus chair to expand family planning services to 35,000 more low-income women in our state. And I worked with the Baltimore City delegation to find a unique way to leverage $1 billion extra for school construction initiatives in the city. The next governor gets to make really important decisions, including whether or not we're going to tackle the income inequality gap in our state. I have a proposal to make sure that middle-class families and seniors on fixed incomes are able to earn more and be taxed less. They'll earn more because we're not going to wait for an election year to address wage stagnation. We're going to not just increase the minimum wage, we're going to get to a living wage in our state. And they'll be taxed less because we're going to ask millionaires and giant corporations to pay their fair share, generating enough income to give 90% of all Marylanders a tax cut and all of our small businesses the tax relief that they deserve. And on education, we're going to tackle the achievement gap in our schools. Unfortunately, in Maryland, it still matters what your socioeconomic status is and what your race is to determine whether or not you're going to be successful in school. And we know it doesn't have to be that way. When we invest in early childhood education initiatives from birth to age 5, we increase the opportunity to eliminate those disparities, give every child an equal chance to enter school ready to learn at the same pace. And so I have an early childhood plan that is a universal pre-K program, an investment in child care subsidies to make sure that low-income and middle-class families have access to affordable child care, and investments in after-school and summer initiatives for our youth.
I believe that's 2 minutes.
Thank you.
And you do mention in your opening statement the importance of minimum wage to you and to your platform. You mentioned specifically raising the wage to $16.70, I believe, and that's necessarily going to impact the business owners' profit margins here in Maryland, especially small business owners. So what we'd like to ask you is, how can you offer that increase while still protecting small business owners who are less capable of absorbing that increased cost of doing business here?
I have a different economic vision for the future of our state. One that doesn't pit workers against businesses. We can have something for everyone, and that's what my plan attempts to do. We can have a minimum wage that gets us on a path to a living wage to $16.70 an hour by 2022, if we also bring meaningful small business relief to the table. Small businesses are the backbones of our economy. They're our job creators. I'm a small business owner myself. I had 9 employees. I know what it's like to create jobs and meet payroll. I also know what it means for government to help businesses be successful. We have a handful of companies in Maryland that play a tax avoidance scheme. These are large corporations that operate in other states as well. They hide the money they're making in Maryland in other states, avoiding paying any tax in Maryland at all. If we hold them accountable to paying their fair share, no more, no less, our corporate tax rate in Maryland is the second lowest in the region, but there are some companies not paying any. If we make them pay their fair share by closing that loophole, we could generate $200 million in new revenue that I don't just put into the budget for plugging budget gaps. It's money that we have as a dedicated reserve fund for small business tax relief. And by giving our small businesses the relief that they need, we can ask more of our small businesses while also making sure that we're taking care of our workers.
Now, you mentioned a potential $200 million revenue boon there, which is a fitting lead into another question that we have here for you tonight, and that relates to a proposal you have about pre-K reform. Now, we did some of the research, and it looks as though it would ultimately cost about $279 million per year to implement the pre-K program that you have in mind. What we'd like to do is ask, how do you anticipate finding the funds for that program?
I don't propose anything in this campaign that I don't also have an idea exactly how we should pay for it. And another big policy that the Delman Coates and Heather Mizeur ticket has been proposing is to make sure that we tackle our failed war on drugs. Our marijuana prohibition laws have been a failure. They have been enforced with racial bias. They detract our law enforcement from focusing on more violent and serious crimes. And if we were to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana, we could generate as much as $170 million in new revenue that I dedicate to paying for the Early Childhood Education Initiative. Now, when Delman and I proposed this last November, people said, oh my gosh, can somebody really take on marijuana legalization in Maryland? That sounds crazy. We said not only will we get it done in 2015 after we have a mandate from the voters to make it happen, but we set the flag for making sure that during this legislative session we would decriminalize possession. People also said that could never be done. Well, Governor O'Malley last week signed our legislation, making Maryland the 18th state, saving another 23,000 people a year from going to jail for the simple nonviolent possession of having marijuana. We were spending $280 million a year in our criminal justice system on the incarceration, detention, and court costs associated with just marijuana possession charges. By eliminating that criminal stigma associated with marijuana, we will not only improve our criminal justice system and have fewer people entangled in it, having fewer people getting tied up in a system that will prevent them from getting future jobs, qualifying for loans, or spending time in jail, but we're going to save important resources. And when we legalize marijuana in 2015, we bring from an underground economy into the light of day and have an opportunity to give adults the chance to make a decision to use a substance that is arguably no more harmful than alcohol or tobacco in terms of toxicity and addictive property. And we should treat it the same way under our laws. And when we do, we'll have the revenue to dedicate to important other priorities, and I've made it very clear that that's exactly how we will pay for our early childhood initiatives.
Now, you mentioned marijuana quite a bit in that answer, but it's fitting lead into one of the other questions that we have, and it focuses on that comprehensive plan to legalize marijuana that you do have. The question, though, focuses on Colorado and a news story that came out recently saying that there had been a death there that's the first recorded death as a result of legalized marijuana in the state. So what we'd like to ask is, as part of this comprehensive plan for legalization, do you have any tangible platforms for policing individuals under the influence of marijuana when it comes to driving under the influence or public intoxication?
Absolutely. We'll treat it the same way we do alcohol under our laws. You can't drink and consume alcohol in public. You can't drive while intoxicated with alcohol. The same would apply towards marijuana. But let me also be clear that this gives us an opportunity to try to keep marijuana out of the hands of youth. No drug dealer is carding for an ID to make sure that young people don't have access. But under a legalized system where you have state-based retail shops where people would be carded to make sure that they have to be of age, you improve the chances of keeping it out of the hands of youth. Because for young people, we do know that it has a dangerous impact on a developing mind. And our proposal spends $4 million a year on a public education campaign to make sure that young people do understand this. And we'll wait until they're an adult to make that decision. But in the same way that Colorado and Washington are not only using their existing laws to police enforcement for intoxication, they're coming up with additional new approaches to track the THC levels for a driver. We're going to learn from what's happening in Colorado and Washington and apply those same best lessons here in Maryland to assure the same.
So just to clarify, as a brief follow-up, are you saying that there are already tests in place in Colorado that would allow a cop who pulls somebody over and is suspicious that they're under the influence of marijuana to test immediately the same way they would with a breathalyzer for alcohol?
It's not. They're currently looking at new technologies that are coming on the market that would allow for that with a saliva test, yes.
Okay. Well, you mentioned education quite a bit in that answer, and we've got an education question, so I'm going to transition to that right now. Democrats often tout that Education Week has named Maryland schools the best in the nation. You really can't go anywhere without hearing that. But if you walk down the street here in Baltimore City, you're going to find a very different circumstance than what you might in one of the wealthier counties in Maryland. So what we'd like to know is, as governor, what would you do to ensure that there is parity across the school systems in Maryland and that people here in Baltimore City had just as much of an opportunity as individuals in wealthier counties?
Thank you. I believe that we're only going to be successful when all of our children are able to be successful. As Vice Chair of Education and Economic Development for the Appropriations Committee, 3 years ago I toured Baltimore City schools and I was devastated by what I saw. Children can't drink out of the water fountains because of the lead pipes. Toilets that won't flush, doors aren't on the stalls, big gaping holes in the infrastructure in the schools. I'd been to prisons that were nicer. And I could have gone home and said, that's Baltimore's problem, I live in Montgomery County. But I didn't. I started to collaborate and work with the Baltimore Education Coalition, BUILD, the ACLU Reform Project here in the city to come up with meaningful approaches for how to find enough money to start truly tackling this problem. It's a $15 billion problem across the state, but nearly $3 billion of it is a problem here in the city. And if we didn't tackle it first here, we weren't going to be able to solve the problem anywhere. And so we've made that first investment. We got that $1 billion in the 2013 session. And in my Jobs and Economic Development Plan, I lay out exactly how we can get more money for phase 2 for the rest of the construction in the city. But we also have to tackle that early childhood education program that I talked about. You'll hear in this race that every Democratic candidate for governor has a pre-K program. Mine's the only one that's truly universal. One candidate says a universal pre-K program is just too expensive and he only wants to cover low-income 4-year-olds. The other candidate says, I'll cover all 4-year-olds, but only if enough families lose their bets at casinos in Maryland. I cover all of our 4-year-olds, regardless of income, and include a half day for 3-year-olds from families earning $70,000 a year or less. It's a truly universal program, and it's not predicated on families losing their bets in casinos. We have a dedicated funding revenue source that will actually come to bear to help pay for this and make sure that all of our schools are the best in the nation and that all of our children are able to enter school ready to learn at the same pace.
So just to clarify for the audience, is that funding going to be flat across the board for any given county? Is there going to be a targeted discretion with that funds? How are you going to isolate schools that need a greater proportion of that funding and make sure that it's going to those places of great need?
We still have in our existing school funding formulas a wealth calculation or a wealth equalization formula that takes into consideration the more intense needs in a jurisdiction like Baltimore City. And I absolutely support that funding formula. It's being re-looked at over the next couple of years, and under my education reform proposals that you'll find in our package, we're proposing a second round of a Thornton Commission style funding commission for our schools and absolutely making the wealth calculation a big component part of that, and making sure that it continues to focus on the needs of high-impact urban areas like Baltimore City.
Okay. Now, our next question talks about the Maryland Health Exchange. And what we'd like to do is to focus on the vetting of those kind of programs. So what we'd like for you to talk about a bit is what kind of fail-safes would you put in place to make sure that all of these programs that are part of your agenda, if implemented, will hit the ground running and will really go to bat right away on day one for Marylanders?
I am a healthcare policy analyst by profession. I spent a decade working on Capitol Hill before I was ever elected in office, working as Senator John Kerry's domestic policy director. I was an early and strong supporter of Obamacare and share your frustration in its failed implementation in our state. The Washington Post has called it a scandal of incompetence. We're well on our way to trying to fix it. The General Assembly stepped in with meaningful reforms, and I was honored to play a role in offering up ideas on how to fix the underlying mess. And it was predicated on work I already had done as a legislator to not just pass meaningful health reform laws, but to make sure they're implemented. We have to get better at the unglamorous side of actually governing. It's not enough to just pass a law and check the box and move on. On that Kids First bill that I talked about, the way that we found 50,000 more children in our state, I wrote that legislation with an understanding that the federal government would give us extra incentive money if we hit certain enrollment targets, if we set this program up in the right way. I not only wrote the legislation that way, but I worked to make sure that we hit our implementation targets. And over the last 4 years, we have gotten $120 million in additional federal money in honor of us having implemented this right and hit our enrollment targets as envisioned. I pushed through, my very first legislation was to allow young adults to remain on their family health plans through age 25. Can I get a shout out for that from all the college students? We did that in Maryland in 2007, before it was picked up as federal law in 2010. And it wasn't enough to just pass it in Maryland and say, okay, I'm moving on to the next one. I sent out information to all the college, university, and community college presidents across the state, making sure they knew of this new change, asking them to help us broadcast it on campus, giving them packets of material to share with incoming students so that they would know they could stay on their family health plans. I worked with large companies to adopt a similar policy for their employees because it's win-win-win for everyone. And when you care about making sure that the goal of what you are passing actually ends up being implemented so that the people you so much wanted to help by this vision that you put forward in legislation actually are connected to the services that you put out there, there's no job for you other than to be on top of working at making sure something gets implemented, that there is accountability, and that there's integrity in the checks and balances of how a program moves forward. I have the experience in doing this. If I had been governor, this problem wouldn't have happened in the first place, and it will never happen again.
Now, you mentioned earlier with the water bottle that you're an environmentalist, and your record certainly reflects that. One of the areas that you've been very active on in the past is fracking. In particular, you've mentioned that in addition to the moratorium that's already on the books for fracking up through August 2014, after the commission comes back and gives their report on it, you'd like an additional 18-month delay before any permits or drilling could occur. So what we'd like to do is ask, what would the purpose of such a moratorium or a stay on permits be for an additional 18 months if it does get a clean bill of health from that commission?
I think by way of background, it might be helpful to just lay the framework on fracking and then answer the question about the legislative review period. Every other state in our region decided to frack first and ask questions later to disastrous consequences. Flammable tap water in Pennsylvania, earthquakes in Ohio, livestock falling over dead in West Virginia from their exposure to toxic chemicals coming out of the wells. I wanted to make sure that in Maryland we demanded that the science dictate our fracking future, that we study and determine what's the impact on the environment, on public health, on our economy before we ever make a decision to drill. Because second chances on this are really expensive. We have to get this one done right the first time. And so with the legislative review period, my concern is sitting on the commission It's been underfunded, behind schedule, and I think when the report comes out in August, if it comes out in August, it might get pushed to the end of the year. It's probably going to be an incomplete report. When we put together the 18 areas of study that in the governor's executive order, there was an estimated $4 million cost to doing these studies. So far, we've only had $1.5 million to do our work. So I've called for the 18-month legislative review period so that there isn't just a commission report that's put out with a bow on it and then pressured for us to start issuing drilling permits. No, we need to give time to determine, are there more questions than answers still? Should we extend the moratorium, find the money, and get real studies done? Did we learn enough to decide maybe we do want to move forward, but it's going to take a whole rewriting of our regulatory system and having new safety implementations put in place before we could ever be comfortable moving forward in our state? Or have we learned enough and know that we don't want to move forward and we need to have a conversation about banning the activity altogether? We won't know for sure which one of those approaches we should take until the legislature has time to review the work of the Safety Commission and make its own recommendation for the public. This is an extra layer of precaution so that the oil and gas industry doesn't get to just rush into the state and push us to start issuing drilling permits just because we've so-called checked the box on having studied it when we actually haven't put enough resources to really find the answers that we said we wanted to learn when we began the process 2 years ago.
Thank you. Now, you have billed yourself as a progressive candidate, and that's a very exciting part of your platform. But there is a concern that sometimes arises with such progressive stances. So what we'd like to know is, do you worry that by being such a progressive candidate, you make yourself, and therefore your party, a bit more vulnerable to a moderate Republican in the general election?
Absolutely not. Our state and its voters have always been way more progressive than our leadership has given us credit for. Take a look at 2012. We barely got marriage equality and the DREAM Act pushed through the legislature. And when they were petitioned to referendum, everyone said, whoa, what's going to happen? It's going to be really tight. We probably won't win, or we might have a hard time getting these things through. Not only did we win with majority votes, we won in jurisdictions in this state with some of our most conservative electorate. And it's because our population is so much more progressive than we give ourselves credit for. Steeled with that, we came into the legislative session in 2013 with a lot of legislators that were willing to get in touch with their progressive core more. We came in and we pushed through death penalty repeal. We did common sense gun safety restrictions. Those all happened because the legislature got an awareness of how the people in Maryland actually expect us to lead on the issues and not just watch all the other states do the interesting things first and follow suit. If anything, if you're a Democrat and you're worried about what will happen in the general election, you should be worried about putting forward a status quo, business as usual politician who gets elected on millions of dollars of corporate and special interest money and who's just running because they're next in line and think it's their turn. The electorate is ready for someone who is standing up with the courage of their convictions to stand up and fight for the things they believe in. I hear all the time, even from conservative Republicans, that they're looking forward to supporting me. They say, I don't agree with you on a lot. In some cases, I don't agree with you on anything. But you're honest, you have integrity, you stand up for what you believe in, and that is refreshing in politics. And I want to see this happen. And I'm done with the machine-style politics in Maryland. And so, if what we're ready to do is turn status quo upside down and change politics as usual, it's time to elect an unapologetic progressive who stands up and fights for what she believes in, because not only will she win a Democratic primary, she absolutely will have the support of a majority of Marylanders to become the next governor of Maryland.
Well, I hope they didn't use up all their applause because, as you know, you've got 2 minutes left to make a closing statement and make your final case to the audience. So if you're ready, you've got the floor.
Thank you again so much. I know you're sitting through lots of dialogue tonight, and I appreciate that you're taking the time out to be here tonight. I hear it in living rooms and senior centers all across this state that our voters are ready for politicians to be positive, to push issues and policy and not just platitudes. that it's time for us to put people first and not the special interests. How you campaign is how you're going to govern. And I'm the first candidate in 20 years to opt into the public campaign finance system, which means I'm not accountable to anybody but you. We can come together and we can do this. You're going to hear throughout this election that the Democratic candidates don't differ much on policy, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I am the only candidate that has a comprehensive middle-class and small business tax cut package. I'm the only one with a truly universal pre-K plan, and absolutely the only one that says a minimum wage isn't good enough, we need a living wage in our state. I am the governor that this state is ready for. I have the experience, the record of accomplishments, and I have the ability to lead from my heart. I know how to get things done. I know how to stand up for the courage of my convictions, take risks that no one else is willing to take because it might cause them re-election. This is about coming together to challenge status quo and to help Maryland live up to her full potential. And with your help, the power is your hands to take this over. This has been a grassroots campaign from the beginning. I started out and everyone said this wasn't even possible. And now the Baltimore Sun says it's a wide open three-way race in the Democratic side. And over these last 64 days, it's up to you to decide what kind of a vision you want for the future of Maryland. And if you share my vision that I have outlined here tonight, then I ask for you to come and be a part of making a big difference together to help Maryland live up to her full potential. I am Heather Mizeur, and I ask for your support for the Mizeur Coats ticket on June 24th. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here tonight.
We do need to take a 10-minute intermission at this point, but we will be started promptly in 10 minutes, so please don't go too far.